I'm Robbie VanVossen with DornerWorks, and I'm going to be presenting on our experiences with trying to mainline code with seL4. So, the goals are, obviously with an open source project, the lifeblood is feeding back new features that you add and contributing so that everyone can kind of gain benefits from new features and bug fixes and all that good stuff. But, sometimes it can be difficult. So really my goals are to give an experience report of, how that's worked for us and kind of what our current status is. And then foster discussion on other people's experiences or maybe ways to improve process both internally and externally to DornerWorks. And, if nothing else, maybe we can just commiserate together. So it's not all doom and gloom. We have had quite a number of successes. We have upstreamed different support for different new platforms. So we've done a large portion of the Zinc UltraScale Plus MPSoC, both the ZCU102 and Ultra 96 boards. We had a hand at least in the i.MX8 support. And then a long time ago, I added support for QB which I don't think anyone ever used. And I'm not sure if it's even still in there, but it does exist. Besides that, we did a lot of work with ARM v8 virtualization support, as well as 64-bit x86 virtualization support. So a lot of these touch both the microkernel itself and then some other user repositories as well. And obviously, it didn't always just go right in. There's definitely some things where the proof engineers needed to really look at ways that we implemented things and possibly even redo them. I hope it was also helpful to see a working reference, though. So some of the challenges, they really come from a few different places. The first one is from our customers, then internally, and then the external ones, which, aside from customer, that would probably be from, the foundation itself with maintenance and the maintainers and reviewers and things like that. And so from our customers, we're really beholden to them. We're beholden to their processes, to their rules. They're giving us money, so they generally get to decide what we get to do with what we create. So, part of that is sometimes there's restrictions due to intellectual property. That one's usually one we can't really work around. However, I think we've gotten pretty good at separating out, this is what's IP, this is what's generally useful, and trying to work with them at the beginning of the contract to determine which things could be open sourced. Probably the more difficult one are export controls. That makes it a lot harder, where you actually have to get a formal release approval for what you're going to be able to open source. And that's not just even pushing up to mainline, but it's even pushing up to like DornerWorks public repositories. And there's a number of contracts where that's just the default, because it's easier for them to say, make everything closed, and then we don't have to think too hard about it. So we do a lot of work to try to make sure that that's not the case. But even when it does end up being the case, we have to figure out how to go through that customer's particular approval process, and that can take a long time. Months. We've had there's a customer where regularly it'll take 6 months from submitting the patches to them before they say, okay, you can publish. Some internal challenges would be, there's just some process stuff built up for us that can present a problem for going to open source. It tends to be kind of our lowest priority for a project, right? Like I said, it still goes back to being beholden to our customers. We have to get the feature done. We have to deliver to them by a certain timeline. But, with the hope that eventually we'll be able to open source it. And so I think one of our big problems is maybe it's habit, and maybe that habit has been formed because of needing to go through specific customer release approvals. But we have a habit of working on everything, getting to the end of the project, and then going for release. Now, I think, one of the things that we could do to help improve that is by, as each feature is completed, trying to get that merged in right then, instead of waiting until we have like 6 features built up and then trying to do them all at once. I think that would improve that. However, it's still going to be dependent on whether it's just our process that's limiting us, or whether it's because our customers have a release approval process. Now, some things that causes is, the further out we go, makes it harder for us, because we end up further out of sync with where the main line is, because we're kind of back at where we started at the project. We tend not to do a lot of rebasing as we go. We tend to get everything functional, and then when we're ready to open source, we'll do a rebase at the end. But so that makes us out of sync, and that results in bigger patches. And then I think one of the other things that kind of results in an issue for us is, I guess we kind of go in guns a-blazing, where we're working with our customer, and we come to an agreement on how we're going to do a feature. We develop it all. We have something functional, and we go, "Hey, seL4 Foundation, you want this?" And you guys go, "Wait. Let's think about how we need to do this." So, maybe getting more involved in the RFC process earlier to get some community feedback on something that will be more likely to make it in the main line than getting to the end and going, "Okay, yeah, it's not really going to work with the proofs that way, or it's not going to fit in the subsystem this way." So, as an example, the SMC RFC that we did, we had it implemented a certain way, and then we got some feedback and had to re-implement it, do some rework, and we could have had less of a headache if we had just started an RFC earlier in the process. Now, I think that's something we need to figure out in terms of, how do we do that with our customers who have export controls, where, sometimes they're even concerned about the idea of what we're going to be doing. And so figuring out, how can we come to an agreement on how we start these communications earlier with the foundation. And then I think another problem that we have is not always developing new tests alongside with new code. And that's kind of getting to my question during Gerwin's presentation. It does feel like the infrastructure is a little bit newer. So I think it hasn't really been a habit for us to develop new tests. I know we have updated seL4 tests in the past, but I think, we need to kind of get more aligned in the process of, hey, we developed a new feature. What new tests do we need to do, and do those alongside the development, so those are ready to go when we're ready to open source. And then external challenges. So, in the past, for sure, there has been a lack in response time for PRs. I think that's gotten a little bit better. It's definitely more timely. However, there are things still that just kind of fall off the radar. We had that x86 64-bit VMM patch that's been mentioned before. It's been just kind of sitting as a PR for 2 years. I think part of that isn't necessarily always external fault. Sometimes that is also our fault, where you just end up kind of with a comment that's like, "Oh, could you change this?" And we go, "Well, I had enough time left over in my project to push it up, but I didn't have enough time to do any of the review rework." So I know there's some push and pull on that on both ends, and us making sure that we have the resources available to still kind of see the process through to the end. Another one that can be difficult for us is denials for dependent patches. So, you know, we'll say have a bunch of changes in like the CamKeys VM repository, but maybe they rely on something in the microkernel. And so now we kind of have like 6 commits that we can't even really make a successful PR for because we're waiting on the one in the microkernel, and that's stalled for whatever reason. Sometimes it's a great reason, sometimes it's just not enough resources. But you know, that can pile up and add to more issues for us. And then I guess the one other thing is RFCs falling off the radar. This one I suppose is fairly specific, but you know, with that SMC one, we reached a point where you know, the discussion kind of just ended as I think there needs to be more community discussion on it. But you know, who drives that? You know, how do we make sure that it doesn't just get lost in everything else going on? You know, maybe that's up to us as we're the ones most interested in seeing the feature, and to kind of revisit and push that and go, you know, let's really think, how can we get this moved forward? And then I guess, so our current state, you know, all of this stuff has kind of been adding up over time. And I'd like to say that we have approximately 100 commits across various repositories that we want to mainline. We want to get into the open source repositories, but we just have a lot of issues. Yeah. So that is all stuff that is blocked either internally or foundation. That's all stuff that's been cleared by our customers. I think a lot of it, the internal issues are really the effect for why we're behind, and it's already, it can go, but the biggest issue is there's a lot of dependencies, and it's even hard for us to figure out what are all the dependencies at this point, because we're kind of at a state where we're like, all right, if you apply these 30 commits to CamKeys VM, then all the rest of our code works. But it's like, you know, what's the ordering for this feature in the microkernel for all the corresponding commits in the CamKeys VM, right? We don't have that linked in a very nice way right now. So I guess to answer your question, it would probably be there's probably like, I don't know, 20 commits that are up right now in PRs, which still isn't even fully external blocking. Some of it's still internal blocking because the review was like, hey, can you add a test? And I haven't added a test yet, right? So I would still call that an internal problem because we just haven't followed the process to the end, and the ball's in our court. But I guess, you know, part of what this does for us is that now this is all stuff that we need to continually push forward. So we need to occasionally do rebases to make sure we're synced up. And when we do merge requests, pull requests, that they're aligned with the mainline, so it's easier for all the CI stuff to function correctly. And so, you know, that's just kind of a pain point we have. It's something I'm trying to figure out how to solve. You know, one thing that I'm considering is kind of building in a rebasing CI where it will overlay all of our work onto the latest every, I don't know, week or something, every few days, and then we'll at least get notified when one of our changes that we have is broken from a new change in mainline, and then figuring out, you know, what resources do I have available to fix that, instead of, you know, waiting for 6 months to go by and then looking at it and then going, oh, there's like 20 things that might be affecting our commits that need to live on top. And then I guess kind of, what our thoughts going forward are is there's two things we need to figure out, which is how to mainline all these commits that we feel we have ready in a way that's feasible, so we can get back to a point where then we can solve our original issue, which is just how do we improve processes so like, at least personally, DornerWorks doesn't get so far behind in a case like this, right? And that's basically what I have. So I'd be interested to see what thoughts or questions others have on this. Thank you.
Test. Is this working? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for this talk, Robbie, because this is also something that we want to make a lot better from the foundation side as well. So I think one concrete suggestion I have would be that the foundation could maybe do is identifying classes of processes that we try to commit to making more like sequential. So for example, in RFC, we consider one at a time and try to have forward progress, because what often happens is it's like there's 6 RFCs open and there's no commitment to closing certain ones in a timely manner. And I'm going to just keep talking until we run out of time.
Hi. So I was going to say the problems you're describing seem very similar to the problems that we've had at, for my day job, I don't really deal with the formal side as much, but we deal with open source projects very regularly, and then several major ones. And these are extremely common problems at basically every tech company that deals with any kind of an open source project. When you're adding new functionality to something and you really need it upstream and you've got other dependencies which are coming. I've seen a lot of times when the project itself would try to address some of these problems by like improving process, and sometimes that can go a long ways, but as a suggestion, what I have seen and what has worked well at some of the companies I've worked at is if you get 1 or 2 people on your staff who can be where their primary responsibility is, or at least like half of their responsibility is just doing community-based stuff for the project. Even though it's like somewhat tangential, and several projects even have a thing where you're not allowed to approve your own company's things and whatnot. That seems to have been, at places I've worked, the most effective way of unsticking this problem. Like, because then if you've got someone who some portion of their time is actually dedicated towards doing other PRs for other parts of that org, it turns out that as a result, you've kind of freed their time to then spend to look at your company's stuff. But that was just a suggestion I would have based on previous experiences with other very large open source projects.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, obviously part of the issue is we're always resource constrained, right?
Yeah.
But doesn't that imply that this makes a difference who the patch comes from, for example? So there are people who are regarded in the community, and they stand a better chance to introduce something into the system than others, newcomers. So it's kind of a social engineering issue here. Right? But I was trying to ask something else about this default reaction of your customers to keep everything closed. Do you see a chance to make them understand that they could even benefit from something being made public?
So surprisingly, the people in charge of the projects actually generally see the value and are the ones pushing for open sourcing, which is quite helpful for us. But there's lots of red tape and processes. One of the things is that 6-month process, it was designed for releasing documents, releasing presentations. It wasn't really designed for releasing code. So I think that's part of why it takes so long. And then the other problem is, some other customers, they know they need a process and they're interested in doing release, but they don't have much experience doing that. And so part of it too is also they're trying to figure out, they're exploring what does this process look like for us to make sure that the only code that gets released into the open source are things that we're not worried about getting released.
I guess to continue on your point, Robbie, that 6-month process not being designed for releasing code, often it makes us end up in a spot where, to avoid having these lawyers review 20-something commits across different repositories, which often have a nice flow of, hey, we're doing one thing in one commit, we often need to combine all the commits into one single commit so they can make sure that we're not, we're leaking data here and removing it here. But if someone reviewed the Git history, they'd be able to see something. So sometimes we end up with, hey, seL4 Foundation, here's this really cool feature that's in one giant commit that does not go with the coding standards, but we don't have the resources to break this back up into a single commit. So, oftentimes that can be something on our end, which we place an unnecessary burden on the foundation that way. Yeah, sorry about that.
So one thing that I noticed in what you said is that I think you said that RFC discussions sometimes stall. Is that right? So that seems like partly a community problem. I'm wondering if we have any solutions for that, and might be Gerwin already knows the answer. Although we should listen to the DornerWorks people as well.
I have a very easy answer for that. It is absolutely up to the person making the RFC to push it.
Sure.
Because, I mean, the default position is the feature doesn't go in. So if you look at RFCs that are successful and go quick, it's where the people who want the feature in have good reasons and can present good reasons for it to go in. Like for a high assurance microkernel, I think that's the only position that we can take.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that, it has to be slow. It's just, and that other people can't help with it. But like the foundation can't say, we're going to commit to decide on every RFC in 2 weeks or something. That's never going to happen.
Right. That's completely understandable. I guess in this specific case, not to pick on you, but, I think the RFC fostered a really good conversation, and there were a lot of good points as to why it shouldn't just be accepted right away without any further thought. But it ended with you saying the community should discuss this more.
Yes.
And I don't know what that means. And do I come back 2 weeks later and go, has the community discussed this? Because I feel like the RFC is the forum for the community to discuss it, right?
I think there's also a bit of nuance, because for the SMC one, as an example, there's a problem it was trying to solve, which is on ARM, you need to perform secure monitor calls to access trusted firmware, and the kernel gives you no mechanism for doing that. And I think we were all pretty unanimous on agreeing that that was a mechanism that the kernel needed to provide. And then, so we knew that we needed something, but then this, because we weren't necessarily making forward progress on a design or an implementation, it stalled. And so we can say, well, by default, we don't accept RFCs, but then we're saying that we're happy with just leaving this known problem that we know is limiting applicability.
Yeah, I guess I wonder, is there, obviously you need to take it at a case-by-case basis, but is there room to say that we don't solve it 100%, right? The big concern that came out of this one was, how do you can't solve worst case execution time. And there's some blocking concurrency issues, right? But it functions, and it is a starting point. And I guess, is there room in the microkernel for unverified pieces of code that we know have issues, but is at least a stopgap to solving some problems?
So I wouldn't say categorically no to that, but it is a very dangerous point for seL4 to be in, right? For SMC specifically, I think that would actually make sense, especially if you can mark it as an experimental feature or something like that. But it is also one that we really should solve properly. And so if you put in a stopgap now, it's still going to be there in 10 years. Like when you see Gernot arguing about the order of syscalls on, frame cap invocations.
Right.
Been there for 13 years. So that's why we would be more conservative. But so for this discussion specifically, like just saying ping what's up is absolutely appropriate. Like if nobody says anything on the discussion, and I mean the people really who need to say something there are Kev and Gernot, I think, on okay, let's screw worst case execution time for this case. We can't solve it right now.
I guess you can also take, in this specific case, I guess this has kind of gone a really specific rabbit hole, but the other approach you could take is you can just not do any of our implementation and just always allow any SMC call made. And that's a really bad implementation, but it's so bad that it will do what we want temporarily, but really?
There's a configuration for just allowing VMs to perform SMC calls.
Then you run into issues with multi-core VMs because they try to use an SMC call to turn on another core, which has already been done.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
all right. Well, maybe we'll look into that as an alternative for. Well, so would I. All right.
Okay, so climbing out of that specific rabbit hole.
Yes.
Just for a moment. So you seem to have the complaint that you didn't know what to do, but it needs more community discussion. So perhaps there should be some guidance on how certain RFCs are closed, what status they're in, and how they can be picked up again. Like, does it need to be championed by someone specific, or can anyone ping with an update, or was that so a bit clearer status would perhaps help that issue? Because I don't think we want people not to know what to do.
Right. And I mean, obviously, I know that I have responsibility and culpability in this, and know that some amount of that responsibility is mine. And if I want to see this go through, I at least need to ping it at some point. The time of how often do I do that? I don't want to do it every day and annoy the crap out of you guys, but figuring out like, how do we push this forward? And I guess maybe at a certain point it is being annoying and just pinging a couple times to say, hey, let's really try to get this through.
So every 1 or 2 weeks, perfect.
Yeah.
Sorry, just so it's in the recording. Every 1 or 2 weeks is perfectly fine. And I'll go on and ping for this one.
I just wanted to add, like, as a more general comment along all the lines that have been discussed, that from Gowen's comment as well, is as a community, we also hear people that are using seL4 and that would be nervous that we would be too lenient and that we wouldn't have these stringent processes, right? And so that the default is convince me that it should be in. That's why that Goen was saying it's on the proposer's person or proposer's side to be able to push that forward and to be. And I acknowledge that sometimes it gets to a position where we're not sure in which direction to push, but it's definitely in the side of the proposer to convince that's a good way to go. Maybe a way forward when it's blocked is to try to summarize which side should be convinced, what kind of conversation should be happening, or what is still missing so that it can move forward. Might be one thing, but definitely we also have the other voices saying, for me to convince my customers, I don't want to be nervous by having like not as a default being no, as a default being yes, maybe let's do it now and see later. That would put a lot of people very nervous. So I just wanted to say that as well.
Sure. Yeah. And I understand that. I'm not trying to argue the opposite case.
And, I just wanted also to thank for the very open description of all of that and trying to pinpoint where the processes can be improved in that direction. And maybe another to shift a bit of the topics here is the hard balance between you mentioned two things, the resources, like having the resources to go afterwards and potentially then the ability to open source. Both of them, I'd strongly encourage to take that as granted from the beginning. Like if you bet on something, and this is a conversation, I don't know how to happen, but this is a conversation between then you and your own customers. Like, hey, we're building on open source, so these are the constraints. And hey, we will have to release those parts. And again, I think there's always this clear boundary that we need to discuss, like kernel versus the rest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how much you can separate those in the way you structure your project, I don't know, but have a different way of, like these parts we build it on open source, we will have to get them integrated, build that resources as well in making sure that you will have that happening from the start rather than, I perfectly understand that if you haven't done that and the project is finished, like, oh yes, please change that. Oh, I've moved on to another project. Who wants to do that? No worries, right? I mean, this is so. I think, of course, it doesn't solve now like the path thing, but in the future to try to have that thing of we're building on something open source, we're building something that will need those interactions from the start. I would build that in your cost from the start so that you know that this will be part of the conversation that you'll need to have with your own customers as much as possible.
For sure. And we actually do that to an extent. Working with open source for many years now, we've really learned that that's a necessity. But I think we don't always quite hit the mark on what that estimate's going to be, especially as features like this are piling up. And I think we kind of have hit that point where we now have two problems to solve, which is how do we get everything synced up such that we can mainline as many of these things that we have built up as possible, and then get to a point where we have a more sufficient process such that we don't get to this state again, or at least not as bad of a state like this.
I kind of forgot what I wanted to say, but I don't have any really good solutions for you. I just wanted to say that it's this is not an entirely unknown position for us. Like in the past, we've also had like seL4 hasn't always been open source, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've had customers like US government that even for writing papers for which the process is designed, that already took 3 to 6 months and so on. So that I see where you're coming from, and it's really it's not that easy to do, but it's kind of in a from an open source maintainer perspective, it's kind of the worst case of contribution. Right? Like it's a big contribution, it does something good that you want, but there's going to be like it's never going to be right on the first go, and if there's no resources for interaction afterwards, it's very, very hard. It's that's not specific to seL4 or something. If you
Right.
think about trying to upstream something into Linux, that's like a way longer process. Like people celebrate that.
Right.
And they,
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope we're faster than that, but but it does cost resources. That's maybe you can now argue that you're at this inflection point. There's so much work to do. Maybe you can budget half a person for a while that does the review feedback, because I think with that, so the problem with the review feedback, what makes some PRs take 2 years instead of a few weeks, is if that loop is fast, it's in everybody's brain and you'll get a fast response.
Yes.
If it comes after 3 months, I'm gonna need 2 weeks to just find the time where I can sit down for a few hours and get everything back in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
And well, then you will need to take a few weeks to
Right.
think about my response.
Yeah, exactly.
So if the loop is fast, or at least that what I've seen from experience, if the loop is fast, then that works.
Yeah.
But it can only be fast if it's not after the end of the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean,
that's a very good point.
And it is true. Sometimes you just hit a bad spot where everybody's busy, and then
Yeah.
Hi. I don't know how many projects you've done, but have you? Do you have to do this every project? Do any projects use seL4 out of the box without your extra commits?
Not really. So we're an engineering services company, and mostly people come to us because the things they want done don't work out of the box. And so we almost always have some level of customization. I guess in some instances, the customization is low, but it's still generally using our distribution as a starting point, because we have built up some of these features and we've built them up because they're based on the needs of our customers. And so, there's a lot of things that like Camke's VM supports right now, but, back a couple of years ago, we had to either develop some of them alongside, or some of them are the new features that I'm talking about that I want to get open source. They're just, general requirements that basically all of our customers have. But after that, there's still usually some amount of customization on top of that.
It's not clear to me if there is a mechanism in place to involve the foundation in the design process, perhaps of a new feature that you're developing, so that you don't come at the end after it's already developed and have an issue with it. Are we able to get that input from the foundation when we begin a feature, so that we're moving in the same direction and the foundation knows that the pull request is coming in because they've been involved?
So the idea of RFCs would actually be that the RFC comes at the very beginning, or like even a pre-RFC discussion where you say, I want to do this feature, I need SMC. And then everybody discusses like, okay, these are the issues, that's what we haven't thought about. And the how the RFC process is designed, that implementation actually only starts after it's approved. That's sort of, it never really works that way. There's this
right
iteration usually, but that's the idea, that discussion comes at the very beginning, and then all the rest, basically.
Is it valid for the RFC process to go, okay, I think we've agreed on an implementation, and then we go dark for like 10 months because we have a few months of implementation, and then the 6 months to get release approval before you'll actually see us submit the code, right?
It's not ideal, but I think it would be better than the other way around.
Okay.
So it sounds like that's maybe a recommended best practice.
The early RFC, yes, absolutely. That's what we, yeah.
So we have this bi-weekly developer hangout, which is the chance to really grab everybody, because you can ignore a mail, you can ignore pull requests. At the hangout, everybody's talking. So I think the best idea is to join this one
and bring this stuff forward. And even if you go dark for 6 months, I mean, you can just join it and say, hey, I'm working on this and I want feedback. And
That's true.
there. I mean, it's supposed to grow and it's supposed to be more interactive. Maybe 1 hour is not enough at some point. I mean, the moment maybe you have to do it weekly. I mean, the idea is it's really interactive. So it's the best chance to grab the foundation.
Yeah.
Whoever the foundation actually is. I mean, in the end, it's people.
Right, I think that's a very good suggestion. I'm not especially keen to make it. Sorry. I think that's a very good suggestion. I'm not especially keen to make it like longer than an hour, but if there is more to discuss, there's absolutely no problem to schedule another one in between or something like that.
Sure.
And that's extremely informal and is kind of, hey, I want to work on this, and what do you think? Kind of stage.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
People use it to remind things that are stolen.
Yeah, just so it's in the recording, June said it's a good way to ping and on what is stalled. That's true as well.
I mean, that has been a thing I've been wondering about. Should we take this hangout to go over the open pull requests? Or is this something we do it 2 times and then we figure out, okay, it's the same list all over, and actually everybody who submits a pull request is supposed to push it, and otherwise it waits until somebody picks it up?
I'm not sure everybody's interested in the pull requests. So I think that's something we should discuss in the hangout, because I'm not sure everybody is interested in the specific pull request list. Like, I mean, it's going to take more than an hour to go through the 60 open pull requests on the kernel repo, right?
I mean, at the moment, there's nothing in place where we go every month or so over all the pending pull requests and just decide, okay, do we close it? Do we write a comment? Is this that? And then close it after a month if there's no response. They're just there.
I would say that should be a separate thing from the hangout. But we might want to do that, but
it seems more like a case-by-case basis thing.
Yeah. And it's nice that the hangout is informal and people can just go and ask about anything, really. It's like an AMA every 2 weeks.
A question to the foundation. So, if I remember correctly, Gernot has some presentation where he shows, okay, this is the seL4 kernel, these are the proofs, so this is seL4 territory. There's something around it, more like drivers, which is more like a cooperation between community and seL4 Foundation. And there's also other code that is, he says, okay, this is userland, this is community. So this is not what seL4 Foundation is focusing on. When I look at the repositories in GitHub, it's all of that. You find pieces of, you have the kernel, you have the driver subsystem, you have platform support, but you have also like Campus components, which is userland implementations of some features, which is, when I look at the explanation from Gernot, it's more like what the community should take more responsibility of. When you look at your pull request processes and RFC processes, what is your take on which of those repositories and topics should be managed by maybe RFC processes and which one should be more in the hands of the community, but then also would need to be decided by single community process to say, okay, this should be in, should be out. Like, for instance, the Campus VM, I'm not sure if this is really part of core seL4 or if it's community part.
Okay. There's no really short answer to this, but from the foundation side, it would actually be very nice. Like, if there is a community around, let's say, Campus, if a few players want to say, okay, we're going to manage this, I'm pretty sure the foundation would be happy to hand that off, basically. The set of repositories that the foundation manages right now basically evolved out of the kernel itself, and then what do I need to build systems on top of that? And Campus was basically the first and only at that time, and now we can see in the community more popping up. CampKIS is still on the foundation of some of these, or even many of these. So it's important that it's being maintained. And it might actually, depending on how it goes, might be important that it is the foundation in the sense that it's a neutral body that, you know, if competing entities work on CampKIS, then it's probably not good if a company does that when the foundation does that. But other things don't need to be. And the RFC process it applies to the entire collection, but it is mostly tuned for kernel changes itself. We do use it for deciding if we want to add a whole new thing to that collection, for instance. So it's the core platform, for instance, that has an RFC where the foundation is deciding, should we take this on as maintained by the foundation? Doesn't have to be. The company that made it, Breakaway, could also say, well, it's my thing. I'll keep it as a separate user level component and I'll maintain it. But instead, they say, okay, it's something that is good for the entire community and where maybe the entire community should contribute. And then it makes sense for the foundation to add that to the set, and adding to that set is basically an RFC process. Like the device driver framework is another one that will probably end up in the foundation, under foundation care. But that doesn't have to be the case. If you have another framework that you think is good, it can be open source, can be closed source, that doesn't have to be in the foundation. And if you find specific bits in the repositories where you would say, that is really something that's important for us, I want to dedicate like half an engineer for keeping that up to date and so on, I'm pretty sure the foundation is going to be very happy about it.
Okay, I think we're over, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks for.
Robbie, we're going to capture these ideas and put them in the slides.
Oh, cool. Great. All right, thanks.